I still remember the day I moved into the apartment. It wasn't much to look at, the paint peeling off the walls, the faint smell of dampness, and a kitchen that had clearly seen better days. But it was affordable, and as a broke grad student juggling part-time jobs and assignments, I didn't have much choice. The ad had promised a cozy apartment with a friendly roommate, and I had to admit, the place had its charm, or at least it did in the photos. The first time I met Neil, my new roommate, I felt a pang of relief. He was soft-spoken, polite, and a bit awkward, but in a way that felt endearing. He had a lanky frame, glasses that seemed too big for his face, and a perpetual slouch. His most striking feature was his smile, wide and slightly crooked, like he wasn't used to smiling much but was making an effort. "Welcome," he said, offering me a hand. His grip was weak, almost hesitant, but his tone was warm. "I'm Neil. Hope you don't mind the mess." The mess he referred to as a pile of books and papers strewn across the coffee table in the living room. Neil explained that he worked from home as a freelance writer, and while the clutter wasn't ideal, it wasn't unbearable. He seemed harmless enough, and after a few hours of unpacking and chatting, I felt reasonably comfortable. The first few weeks passed without incident. Neil mostly kept to himself, typing away on his laptop late into the night. Occasionally, we'd watch a movie together or share a meal. He wasn't particularly talkative, but when he did speak, he had a dry sense of humor that I found oddly charming. He told me he'd been living in the apartment for 3 years and that I was his 4th roommate. "Why did the others leave?" I asked one evening, half joking. Neil's smile faltered for a moment before he shrugged. "People move on, I guess. Better jobs, better places. You know how it is." I didn't press further, though his response lingered in my mind. It started with small things. I'd notice items in my room weren't where I'd left them. A book I'd been reading would be slightly askew, or my laptop lid would be open when I distinctly remembered closing it. At first, I brushed it off as forgetfulness. The stress of balancing school and work was taking its toll, after all. But then there were the noises. Late at night, I'd hear faint creaks and whispers coming from the walls. The building was old, and I'd assumed it was just the sound of the structure settling, but the whispers, they were too deliberate. Too human. I'd get up to investigate, but the sounds would stop the moment I left my room. Neil, of course, claimed he hadn't heard anything. "This place can be creepy at night," he said one morning over coffee, his eyes darting around nervously. "Old pipes, thin walls. You'll get used to it." But I didn't get used to it. If anything, things only got stranger. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of my doorknob turning. My heart froze. I stared at the door, willing it to stay shut. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The next morning, Neil was his usual self, cheerful and oblivious. I didn't mention it. I began to feel like I was being watched. Whenever I was in the living room or kitchen, I'd catch Neil glancing at me out of the corner of my eye. His gaze lingered a little too long, his smile a little too wide. It was subtle enough that I couldn't accuse him of anything without sounding paranoid, but it was unsettling nonetheless. One evening, while Neil was out, I decided to snoop around his room. I know it was a violation of privacy, but I needed answers. His room was surprisingly bare, just a bed, a desk, and a bookshelf. But on the desk, I found a notebook. Flipping through it, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was filled with detailed observations about me, what time I left for class, what I ate, what I wore. There were even sketches of me, crudely drawn but unmistakable. My hands trembled as I put the notebook back where I found it. I considered confronting Neil but decided against it. What if he denied everything? What if he became violent? I needed to leave, but breaking the lease wasn't an option, and finding a new place on short notice was financially impossible. Things escalated quickly after that. One night, I woke up to find Neil standing in my doorway, watching me. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see the glint of his glasses. "Neil?" My voice was shaky. He didn't respond. He just stood there for a moment longer before turning and walking away. I locked my door after that, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, Neil acted as if nothing had happened. I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. That evening, I confronted him. "Neil, have you been coming into my room at night?" His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb. I saw you last night. And I've seen your notebook." For a moment, his face went blank. Then, to my surprise, he chuckled. "You went through my stuff? That's not very roommate-like." "That's not the point, Neil. Why are you keeping tabs on me? Why were you in my room?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and walked to his room, shutting the door behind him. I heard the click of a lock. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. That night I barely slept. Every sound, every creak set me on edge. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside my door. Then, a faint scratching sound. I clutched my phone, ready to call the police, but the sound stopped before I could muster the courage. The following morning, Neil was gone. His room was empty. His belongings vanished. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt a deep sense of unease. He'd left without a word, without any indication of where he'd gone. The landlord had no answers either. For weeks, I lived in fear, jumping at every shadow, every unexpected noise. I changed the locks, installed security cameras, and even considered moving out, but nothing happened. It was as if Neil had disappeared entirely. Then, one day, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph of me, taken from outside my window. On the back, in Neil's handwriting, were the words, "I'll be watching." I handed the photo to the police, but without any tangible evidence or knowledge of Neil's whereabouts, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to stay vigilant and keep my doors locked. To this day, I don't know what Neil's intentions were or why he fixated on me. Maybe he was just a lonely, disturbed man. Maybe he had darker plans. All I know is that I'll never feel truly safe again. I still remember the day I moved into the house. It was an old, sprawling Victorian on the outskirts of the city, with ivy crawling up the brick walls and a creaky wooden porch that groaned under the weight of every step. The rent was surprisingly low, and though the place felt eerily empty, I chalked it up to its size. The landlord had assured me that my new roommate, Simon, was a quiet, reliable guy who worked nights and kept to himself. The first time I met Simon, he seemed ordinary enough. He was in his late 30s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a calm demeanor. Dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, he looked like someone who had his life together. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm but cold, and his piercing blue eyes held my gaze for a moment too long. "I'm Simon. Welcome to the house. It's usually pretty quiet around here." His room was upstairs, while mine was on the ground floor, near the kitchen. The arrangement suited me fine. I liked my privacy, and Simon's nocturnal schedule meant we'd rarely cross paths. At first, things were uneventful. The house was drafty and prone to creaks and groans, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. I spent my evenings working on my freelance graphic design projects, and occasionally watching TV in the living room. Simon would come and go silently, often leaving the house around dusk and returning just before dawn. It wasn't until the third week that I started noticing oddities. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I noticed a faint, metallic smell in the kitchen. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered, sticking to the back of my throat. When I asked Simon about it, he shrugged. "Probably the plumbing," he said. "This place is old. Things break down all the time." His explanation seemed plausible, but the smell persisted, and I started to feel uneasy. Then there were the locked doors. Aside from our bedrooms, there were 2 other rooms in the house, one upstairs and one in the basement, that were always locked. When I asked Simon about them, he was evasive. Just storage, he said. Nothing interesting. One night, curiosity got the better of me. Simon had left for work, and I decided to investigate the basement door. I tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, I examined the door frame and noticed faint scratch marks near the lock, as if someone had tried to force it open. A chill ran down my spine, and I hurried back to my room, resolving to ignore the locked doors and mind my own business. But things only got stranger. I began hearing noises at night, soft, shuffling sounds, as if someone was moving furniture or dragging something heavy across the floor. At first, I assumed it was Simon, but the sounds seemed to come from the locked basement. One night, I crept out of my room and pressed my ear to the basement door. I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the ticking of a metronome, but slower and more deliberate. My heart pounded as I backed away and returned to my room, locking the door behind me. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I noticed a smudge on the window. Leaning closer, I realized it was a fingerprint on the outside. My stomach dropped. The house was surrounded by dense shrubbery, and the window was at least 6 feet off the ground. Someone would have had to climb to leave that mark. That night, I decided to confront Simon. When he came home, I was waiting in the living room. "Simon, have you noticed anything strange around the house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow. "Strange? Like what?" "Noises at night. And I found a fingerprint on the kitchen window. From the outside." Simon's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something. Annoyance? Concern? "This is an old house," he said calmly. "It makes noises. And as for the fingerprint, maybe it's from the last tenants. You're letting your imagination get the better of you." His dismissal only heightened my suspicion. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard the tapping again, louder this time. Summoning my courage, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, I approached the basement door. The tapping stopped as I reached it. My hands trembled as I tried the knob, but it was still locked. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Whirling around, I saw Simon standing at the top of the stairs, his face expressionless. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and even. "I heard something," I stammered. "Coming from the basement." Simon's eyes narrowed. "The basement is off limits. You shouldn't be snooping around." I wanted to argue, but something in his tone made me stop. Without another word, I retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, Simon was gone. His room was empty, and there was no sign of him anywhere in the house. I felt a mix of relief and dread. Determined to uncover the truth, I broke into the basement. The lock was surprisingly easy to pick, and the door creaked open to reveal a steep staircase leading down into darkness. The smell hit me first, the same metallic tang I'd noticed in the kitchen, but stronger. Covering my nose with my sleeve, I descended the stairs. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room filled with shelves of jars and tools. In the center of the room was a large metal table, stained with something dark and sticky. My stomach churned as I realized what it was. On the far wall, a series of photographs were pinned to a corkboard. My face stared back at me from every image. Some were taken inside the house, others from outside my bedroom window. Among the photos was a handwritten note. "Subject 5, observations ongoing." Panic surged through me, and I fled upstairs, grabbing my phone to call the police. When they arrived, I showed them the basement. My heart pounded as I backed away and returned to my room, locking the door behind me. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I noticed a smudge on the window. Leaning closer, I realized it was a fingerprint on the outside. My stomach dropped. The house was surrounded by dense shrubbery, and the window was at least 6 feet off the ground. Someone would have had to climb to leave that mark. That night, I decided to confront Simon. When he came home, I was waiting in the living room. "Simon, Have you noticed anything strange around the house? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow. Strange? Like what? Noises at night. And I found a fingerprint on the kitchen window. From the outside. Simon's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something. Annoyance? Concern? This is an old house, he said calmly. It makes noises. And as for the fingerprint, maybe it's from the last tenants. You're letting your imagination get the better of you. His dismissal only heightened my suspicion. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard the tapping again, louder this time. Summoning my courage, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, I approached the basement door. The tapping stopped as I reached it. My hands trembled as I tried the knob, but it was still locked. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Whirling around, I saw Simon standing at the top of the stairs, his face expressionless. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and even. "I heard something," I stammered. "Coming from the basement." Simon's eyes narrowed. "The basement is off limits. You shouldn't be snooping around." I wanted to argue, but something in his tone made me stop. Without another word, I retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, Simon was gone. His room was empty, and there was no sign of him anywhere in the house. I felt a mix of relief and dread. Determined to uncover the truth, I broke into the basement. The lock was surprisingly easy to pick, and the door creaked open to reveal a steep staircase leading down into darkness. The smell hit me first, the same metallic tang I'd noticed in the kitchen, but stronger. Covering my nose with my sleeve, I descended the stairs. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room filled with shelves of jars and tools. In the center of the room was a large metal table, stained with something dark and sticky. My stomach churned as I realized what it was. On the far wall, a series of photographs were pinned to a corkboard. My face stared back at me from every image. Some were taken inside the house, others from outside my bedroom window. Among the photos was a handwritten note. Subject 5, observations ongoing. Panic surged through me, and I fled upstairs, grabbing my phone to call the police. When they arrived, I showed them the basement. I still remember the day I moved into the apartment. It wasn't much, a modest 2-bedroom unit in a nondescript building in the heart of the city. The rent was cheap, which was a rare find in this part of town, and the landlord had assured me that my new roommate, Derek, was a solid guy who'd been living there for years. I was in desperate need of a place, and Derek seemed normal enough when I met him briefly during the tour. "Welcome," Derek had said with a friendly smile, extending his hand. He was in his late 20s, with short brown hair and a wiry frame. His handshake was firm, his demeanor casual. He was dressed in sweatpants and a hoodie, the kind of outfit that made him look approachable, almost unremarkable. "I'm usually out during the day, so you'll have the place to yourself most of the time." At first, everything seemed fine. Derek was friendly but not overly intrusive. He worked as a courier, often leaving early in the morning and returning late in the evening. I liked having the apartment to myself during the day. The space was small but cozy, and I quickly made it my own, setting up my desk near the window and arranging my books on the shelves in the living room. The first oddity I noticed was the door to Derek's bedroom. It was always locked. At first, I thought nothing of it. Some people value their privacy. But over time, it started to gnaw at me. One evening, while Derek was out, I accidentally knocked a glass off the counter in the kitchen. It shattered on the floor, and as I cleaned up the mess, I realized I didn't have a dustpan. I checked the pantry and the hall closet but couldn't find one. On a whim, I tried Derek's door, wondering if he might have some cleaning supplies in his room. The knob didn't budge. When I asked him about it later, he shrugged. "I just like keeping my space private," he said. "Nothing personal." That was the first red flag. The second came a week later, I'd stayed up late working on a freelance project, and as I climbed into bed around 2 a.m., I heard faint noises from the living room. At first, I thought it was Derek. Maybe he'd come home without me noticing. But when I got up to check, the room was empty. The front door was locked, and there was no sign of him. I told myself it was just the old building settling or the neighbors upstairs and went back to bed, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Over the next few days, I started to notice other things. The kitchen cabinets seemed to rearrange themselves. A glass I'd left on the counter would be back in the cupboard, or a loaf of bread I'd left out would be tucked away. My keys, which I always hung on the hook by the door, would sometimes appear on the coffee table or the kitchen counter. I'd wake up to find the bathroom light on, even though I was sure I'd turned it off before bed. When I brought it up to Derek, he laughed it off. "You're just not used to the place yet," he said. "Happens to everyone." But his nonchalance didn't sit right with me. One night, determined to put my paranoia to rest, I set up a cheap webcam in the living room, pointing it at the front door. If someone was coming in and moving things around, I'd catch them on camera. The next morning, I checked the footage. At first, everything seemed normal. The timestamp showed me coming home around 6 p.m., eating dinner, and settling in to watch TV. Around 1 a.m., I turned off the lights and went to bed. The room was dark for a few hours, but then, at 3:14 a.m., the webcam captured movement. A shadow passed through the living room, heading toward the kitchen. My heart raced as I rewound the footage. The shadow was indistinct, but it was unmistakably human. I confronted Derek that evening. "Were you in the living room last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He frowned. "No. I was at work." "Why?" I thought I heard something," I said, deciding not to mention the camera. He shrugged and went back to his room, leaving me feeling more unsettled than ever. That night, I locked my bedroom door before going to bed. I lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the apartment. Around 3 a.m., I heard the soft pad of footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside my door, and I held my breath, clutching my phone in case I needed to call the police. After a few agonizing minutes, the footsteps moved away, and the apartment fell silent again. The next day, I decided to take a closer look at Derek's room. He'd left for work, and I figured if I could find a key or some other clue, I might be able to figure out what was going on. I started with the living room, searching behind the couch cushions and inside the drawers of the TV stand. In one of the drawers, I found a small notebook. The cover was plain black, unmarked, but when I flipped it open, I felt a chill run down my spine. The notebook was filled with names, dates, and brief descriptions. Most of the names were unfamiliar, but a few stood out, former tenants, according to the landlord's stories. The last entry was my name, followed by the date I'd moved in and a single word: observing. I put the notebook back and left the apartment, my heart pounding. I spent the day at a coffee shop, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that there had to be an explanation. But when I returned home that evening, I found a note on the kitchen counter. It was written in blocky, unfamiliar handwriting: "Stay out of my room." That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept my bedroom door locked and a kitchen knife under my pillow. Around 3 a.m., the footsteps came again. This time, they stopped outside my door for several minutes. Then I heard the soft click of the lock turning. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The door didn't open, but the fact that Derek had a key to my room was enough to push me over the edge. As soon as dawn broke, I packed a bag and left the apartment, vowing not to return. I went to the police with the notebook and the footage from my webcam, but they said there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. When I called the landlord to tell him I was moving out, he sighed. "I was afraid this might happen," he said. "You're not the first tenant to have problems with Derek. But he's always paid his rent on time, and I can't evict him without cause. I've since moved into a new place, one with no roommates and multiple deadbolts on the door. But I still wake up at night, certain I've heard footsteps in the hallway. And sometimes I find things in my apartment moved ever so slightly, as if someone's been there while I was asleep." I can't prove it, but I know Derek isn't finished with me yet. Hey everyone, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It truly means a lot. As a broke college student editing all my videos on an Android phone, it takes a lot of effort to bring these stories to life. A laptop would help me create better content faster, so if you enjoy my work, please subscribe and share. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you so much.